issues. Here, okay? Does anybody want to just give me a little thumbs up that you can hear on the chat? Yeah. Can you hear?
I can see everything.
Yeah, okay. Okay, we're good to go then. Thank you for your patience, everyone. And thank you to everyone who's made it to the live event, and also a big welcome to all of you who will watch the recording. So I'm aware that many of you plan to come, but with the schools closed again here in Northern Ireland, it's a bit more difficult. So we're really pleased we can provide a recording of this event, and we'll send that out to you afterwards. So today's event has been jointly organised by the Southeastern and the Western Drug and Alcohol Connection Services. So both Southeastern and Western Connection Services are funded by the Public Health Agency under Northern Ireland's Alcohol and Drug Strategy. And we are based in ASCERT, a leading drug and alcohol organisation providing drug and alcohol services for the past 21 years across Northern Ireland. So you will find a drug and alcohol connections team in each of the 5 trust areas within Northern Ireland. And we work towards addressing issues around alcohol and other drug use through promoting regional awareness campaigns, signposting to services, responding to drug and alcohol related incidents, and delivering awareness raising sessions. So part of our work involves working closely with our local drug and alcohol coordination team, which is the DACT, and the DACT brings together a range of statutory and voluntary organisations to promote a coordinated local approach to addressing alcohol and other drug issues. So, and I am delighted that the chair of the Southeastern DACT, Ed Seifler, is co-hosting our event today, and I will pass over to him in just a moment. So the plan for today is that Professor Nutt is going to speak to us for about an hour until about maybe about 11:30, and then we will have about 30 minutes for questions, and we'll be finished by 12 o'clock. So before we get to that, my colleague Jenny Boyle from the Western Connection Service is going to talk us through a little housekeeping. Over to you, Jenny.
Okay, thanks. Hi everyone. It's just to go through a few points about Blue Jeans. Some of you might be new to it. As we've seen so far, you are making great use of the chat box. So we would encourage you, as the presentation goes on, that you continue to do that. Whether it's something crops up that's really interesting or just engaging with each other about what's being spoken about. You'll also see a Q&A box. If you have any questions that you do want possibly raised for Professor Nutt at the end, could you please make sure to use the Q&A box, because others can then upvote in the box. So the ones that other people feel that they would like to see answered as well will then move to the top. So please make use of that. As Pamela has noticed, recording will be, or she's said that the recording will be made available at the end. So we'll get that sent out to you probably via email, or we'll send you the link of where it can be found. And at the end, we will pop up a short evaluation or a link to evaluation. We would ask that you just it won't be very long, if you take a few minutes to complete it. And if you don't get it on the link here, then we will be sending it out via email afterwards. So again, please just take a few minutes. I'm going to put up in the chat box just our contacts. So you'll get us on Facebook and Twitter at NIDACS, and you'll get us on the drugsandalcohol.info website. We'll put up our email addresses and details like that, so you might be able to give us a follow then on social media. Thank you.
Great, thanks Jenny. So this event has come about in response to our work in the community, where over the last number of years we've noticed a huge interest and curiosity about the use of CBD and cannabis as medicine. So we've been providing information at events and speaking to people and awareness sessions about the medical use of cannabis. And due to the level of interest, we really wanted to take this further, and we're absolutely delighted that Professor Nutt agreed to come along and talk to us today. So before we hand over to him, I'd like to invite Ed Seifler to say a few words. So Ed is known to probably many of you. He is an addiction specialist in the Southeastern Health and Social Care Trust, and we are also very lucky to have him as the chair of the Southeastern DACT. So he is always the voice of reason and compassion, so we are delighted to have him as part of the panel today. So over to you, Ed.
Thanks, Pamela. I'm delighted this event's happening today, and want to thank everybody for taking the time to come. When we're in the middle of a revision of our alcohol and drug strategy, the timing couldn't be more important because of COVID and the way all this is affecting our communities, our society. And the revised strategy, and shortly you will be getting a draft to comment on, and it really would be important for all of you to look at it, to comment on it, but it does say some important points. The cost of alcohol and drug issues is going up. And when we look at, there's no question about this, alcohol remains our most misused drug. Right behind that, cannabis is our most misused illegal drug. Now, I'm delighted this event's happening because for years, decades, we've demonized drugs. We've been, campaigning, that, to really highlight the dangers of drugs. Well, now there's a shift, and we're hearing the medicinal purpose or properties of a range of psychedelic medications for treating issues. Now, the evidence is growing, but it could be a bridge too far. So absolutely delighted we have somebody as eminent as Professor David Nutt here. Gives me a chance to introduce you. David, who's chair of drug science, a leading independent scientific body on drugs in the UK. He's also professor of neuropsychopharmacology at the Imperial College London. Now, I think everyone here would have heard Professor Nutt speak. His views are well known. We're delighted he can share his insight into where we're going with cannabis. I liked how, Pamela, you introduced this, getting people to think about where do we go with this. So thank you very much. Really keen to hear what Professor Nutt has to say this morning.
Great. Over to you, Professor Nutt. Yeah.
This is me to start. So let's just see. What can you see my screen? Is that right? Can you all see the full screen now?
That's good. Yes, that's good.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to talk to you, and it's great to see so many people online currently. Before I tell you a bit about drug science, I just want to note that all the slides I'm using today are slides which are on the drugscience.org website, and you can go there, you can download them, you can use them for any purpose you like. You'll also find on that website an enormous a number of pieces of information relating to other drugs, and particularly if you're interested in psychedelic research, which is something that is clearly evolving at present. There's also slide sets on that. So drug science is a tremendous resource about drugs. You can access publications, you can access teaching material, etc. So what is drug science? Well, it's something I founded in 2009. I founded it because some of you may know I was summarily dismissed by the Home Secretary at the time, Alan Johnson. I was chair of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, and he didn't like the fact I was arguing that drug policy wasn't evidence-based. And fortunately, I was supported by an independent charity to set up basically an independent ACMD, which is free for political interference and free from the threat of censorship by the government. So we're a not-for-profit charity. We have a scientific committee, which I think I can say contains the vast majority of people in Britain who've got good definitive knowledge about drugs, but in relation both to science, research, and also policy. We're completely independent. We've got academic credibility. As a charity, we're extraordinary, very unusual in that almost everything we do, almost every paper we publish, or every piece of research we put out, gets into peer-reviewed publications. We've had many publications in the Lancet and the BMJ because our view is that we have to have the highest level of evidence to support our decision-making. And medical cannabis is something that's been really quite central to a lot of our discussions over the last 10 years. So this is what I'm going to talk to you today about. I'm going to talk to you about the drug science perspective on medical cannabis. And the first thing to say is that cannabis has been around for a long time. It's arguably the world's oldest medicine. The earliest recorded use of cannabis in this pharmacopoeia in China nearly 5,000 years ago. And it very up to date, really, because it indicated over 100 different ailments for which could respond to cannabis, including gout, rheumatism, and malaria. It was widely used in India from about 4,000 years ago, and it still is. It's still used as in religious ceremonies in India. And one of the Vedas, one of the sacred Hindu texts, talks about cannabis as one of the 5 sacred plants. And it's India was the source of cannabis from a lot of the West, the East and the West, for very many years. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Ancient Egyptians used it, and medical cannabis was used, and the evidence of it being present in the tombs of the pharaohs. There's a very famous excavation recently of was thought to be a Siberian princess, and she was buried, and she had breast cancer, and she was buried with cannabis. Presumably she was using it to deal with the pain. And then 200 AD in China, we come to this the first recording of cannabis being used in surgery. And I thought this was really quite amusing, that the word for anesthesia in Chinese is cannabis intoxication. So I think we can say it's been around a long time. We've got quite a lot of knowledge of its effects and also of its safety. Although hemp was grown in Britain, the low THC cannabis plant hemp was grown. In fact, it was grown under a diktat. Henry VIII made it a rule that every farm in Britain, every farmer had to grow at least one field of hemp, because hemp was used to make jute, which was used to make canvas and ropes for the sailing industry. There wasn't the high THC cannabis wasn't available, or wasn't much known about then, and it really entered Britain in 1689 when there was a report by the Royal Society. The first president of the Royal Society, Hooke, commented on the effects of cannabis to make people relaxed and chatty, and perhaps a little too much so. The real modern story came in about the 1850s when William O'Shaughnessy published his Bengal Dispensary and Companion to the Pharmacopoeia, because at that time the British East India Company was making a lot of money selling cannabis to Indians. Indians used to grow their own, and then the Brits took over India and they made cannabis a cash crop, and they started selling it to Indians. And it's quite interesting to reflect on the fact that the British Empire, the greatest empire the world has ever known, built under Queen Victoria, was largely built on the proceeds of selling cannabis to Indians and opium to the Chinese, both under duress. But anyway, that's the past. O'Shaughnessy realized that there were benefits of cannabis. He brought it into Britain, and it was widely used. It was widely used as a tincture. And in 1870, Thomas Clouston won the Fothergill Gold Medal of the Medical Society of London for his work on the use of hemp drugs, cannabis drugs, in the treatment of mental illness. So cannabis was seen as quite an important innovation. So much so that Queen Victoria used it. Her physician, J. Russell Reynolds, wrote the definitive text in the Lancet in, I think, 1889, saying what cannabis was useful for and how to use it. And Queen Victoria, we believe, used it to deal with period pains and the pains of childbirth and subsequent childbirth. But there's always been hostility to cannabis, and the first, I suppose you might, the first engagement in the anti-cannabis battle started in 1890s, and it's been running ever since. And that was when there was a debate in Parliament on cannabis and the dangers of cannabis. And it's important to remember at that time, there was a very powerful prohibition movement developing in most Western countries. And it was not just about cannabis. It was the prohibition movement, which was really taking on every single substance which people might use to reduce pain and suffering or pleasure. So that was the beginning of the control of opium tinctures, of cannabis tinctures, and of course the beginning of the prohibition of alcohol, the movement to prohibit alcohol. So the puritanical movement of the 1880s and 1890s got a debate in Parliament about the harms of cannabis, particularly in relation to the Indians who were using it. So the Indian Hemp Commission was set up. The Indian Hemp Commission showed very clearly that there was no relationship whatsoever between cannabis use and mental illness. And things then died down until, paradoxically, the prohibition of alcohol. And as you are all aware, alcohol prohibition didn't really work very well. It certainly it might have reduced consumption of alcohol a bit, but it led to enormous social problems. Eventually, every policeman in America was corrupted by the speakeasies, the underground bars, which sprung up in every town. And it led to the rise of the mafia and organized crime. It led to enormous violence. And it led to the development of an organization, a separate police force called the Drug Enforcement Agency. America is the only country in the world that has its own police force to regulate the use of drugs. And that all stemmed from trying to create a police force that wouldn't be corrupted as the local police were by the underground alcohol market in the States at that time. It was clear to the American people after over a few years that this wasn't working. And the people wanted to drink. And so eventually in 1933, the Prohibition Act was repealed. And that left this man, Harry Anslinger, who was the head of the DEA, with a bit of a headache. Because at that point, he was the second most famous man in America. He was more famous than the president, second only to Hoover, as the head of the FBI, is the most famous man. Because every day he was in the news telling people how his team of specially trained untouchables were destroying alcohol stills, etc. He had 35,000 people working for him. He was very famous, and he was faced with redundancy. So he scrabbled around to find something else that his people could work on. And he happened upon marijuana. Well, he happened upon cannabis, but he changed the name to marijuana because he wanted to associate cannabis use with Mexicans and then begin to use the fear of the foreigner crossing the Mexican border into America, bringing their dangerous drugs as a way of justifying the perpetuation of his organization. And it was truly remarkable. The American government bought into this in big time. Here's a statement he made, which you all know is completely and utterly absurd. Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of the world. Well, of course it is if you shoot people who take it. But certainly the users of marijuana are almost very, very rarely violent. And he generated hysteria, and here are a few pictures of the kinds of covers that he incited newspapers and comic books to produce. And you can see it's always the classic relationship. There's semi-naked women, and there's the threat to our young people. And it was really very powerful. It was very effective. And in a way, it's the story of cannabis as a threat to the world, the Western world, or the world generally, hasn't changed since then. And it hasn't changed because of the enormous power that the US has influence in international organizations. So in 1934, the United Nations, the US government, even though they weren't part of the League of Nations, persuaded the League of Nations to decide to state that cannabis had no medical value. And they did that on the belief that if you removed cannabis as a medicine, it would stop people using cannabis. I mean, of course, it's a completely fanciful idea. And it was one that was equally flawed when they removed heroin from the medical pharmacopoeia in the States in the 1940s. But in order to get the League of Nations to say that cannabis had no medical value, they wrote a report which basically said cannabis has no medical value. And that was relied upon by not just the League of Nations, but what came to follow it, the WHO and the UN, until very recently. So that report has been the argument against medical cannabis until WHO reviewed it after great pressure from, amongst others, ourselves, just 2 years ago. But it got worse. In 1961, the Egyptian government was going through a period when one of its senior physicians was convinced that mental illness was caused by cannabis, and was obsessed with the idea that if we stop cannabis use, people would stop having schizophrenia. And the US at that time wanted some air bases in Egypt. So a deal was done that cannabis would then be made Schedule 1 under the first of the UN conventions, the 1961 UN Convention on Narcotic Drugs. And it's still there. Cannabis is still a Schedule 1 or Schedule 4, depending on its formulation, in the UN conventions. Even though in some countries, as I'll tell you, it's now become a medicine. And then things got worse with Nixon. So those of you who are old like me might remember the war in Vietnam, and Nixon was losing the war. And a bit like Trump today, he was faced with defeat in the election. So he decided he had to deflect attention from his failings in Vietnam, and he had to find a war he could fight that the American people would support him and vote for him to fight. So he created the war on drugs. And that was truly one of the most successful election campaign inventions of all time. He went from lagging in the polls to winning every state except Maine, because he promised the American people that he would protect them from these evil drugs. And the evil drugs he was protecting them from were cannabis and heroin. And the war on drugs, as you probably know, has cost over £1 trillion. It's taken over 500,000 lives and served no purpose other than to keep people employed in fighting the war. The one consequence of the war on drugs is that there was enormous pressure put on the countries like the UK, which still had medical cannabis. We in fact continued to use medical cannabis until 1971. And eventually in 71, when we brought in the Misuse of Drugs Act, cannabis was taken out of the pharmacopoeia. And that was directly due to pressure from the US. They've been banging on for decades. And I don't know what deal was done. It's impossible to find out. But some deal was clearly done that we conceded and went along with the Americans that cannabis had no medical value. And I think it's perhaps the only time in history, the only drug that has ever been removed from the pharmacopoeia based on an act of parliament. And the justification that the government had for banning cannabis was that there were 2 GPs in Ladbroke Grove who were prescribing medical cannabis and suggesting that people use it recreationally. And it's kind of absurd, really, isn't it? I mean, it was such a clearly a kind of fictitious kind of justification for banning a drug. There were plenty of GPs that were inappropriately prescribing heroin for recreational use, but all they did was get struck off. We didn't ban heroin, but we banned cannabis because the Americans wanted us to. And it's effectively been banned until the last 2 years ago. Now, the ban has been broken, and it's particularly interesting to be talking to a Northern Irish audience about the breaking of the ban, because one of maybe the main protagonist in getting the UK to reverse its attitude to cannabis is the case of Billy Caldwell. And Billy lives in Northern Ireland, and he has one of these rare but very devastating forms of epilepsy called Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. And he has thousands of seizures a month. And his mother was discovering these seizures didn't respond to anything that was being prescribed by the pediatricians in Northern Ireland. And she heard about an American family whose daughter Charlotte had the same syndrome and had her seizures dramatically reduced while using cannabis medicines. So they went to America, they got it treated, and Billy recovered. Billy's seizures disappeared. And she had spent some time in the US, some time in Canada, and then decided she wanted to come back to her home in Northern Ireland. And because cannabis was illegal, she couldn't get it in Britain. So she came back into Heathrow with his supply of medicine from Canada, and she declared it. at Heathrow, and the customs officer said, well, it's an illegal drug, we have to confiscate it. Even though, and her description of that interchange was that the customs officer was in tears because he knew that he was potentially condemning Billy to death. But the law said he had to remove this dangerous drug to protect the British public from whatever she might do with it. I don't know, maybe sell it, I don't. And sorry, I've jumped the gun a little, but there was she did come back to Northern Ireland for a period when a GP in Northern Ireland was prepared to prescribe it. And he was getting it from either Southern Ireland or from Holland. But he was told to stop prescribing. He was told he was guilty of gross professional misconduct, or he would have been taken to the GMC for gross professional misconduct if he continued to prescribe. So then she went back to Canada. He got more supplies. She got her son treated again. She came back to Heathrow. Her drug was confiscated, and that was in the summer of 2018. And as predicted, Billy went into status epilepticus. He was admitted to hospital. Fortunately, he was admitted to St Thomas's Hospital, which is just across the Thames from the Houses of Parliament. So the parliamentarians could look across to the hospital where Billy was dying on ventilation. And the threat of him dying as a result of the seizure of his medicine eventually persuaded the Home Secretary to give Billy a special license so that his mother could import cannabis to treat her son. And that was the first such license, and then Hannah Deakin got one for her son. And the whole debate really then opened up. And Billy survived. Billy went from being intensive care to being almost a normal child now, has virtually seizure-free. Although he's still struggling, his mother is still fighting battles in Northern Ireland to get access to the drug on the NHS, because although she has a license, she's got to import at a huge cost, thousands of pounds a month. But because of the absurdity of that situation, it was apparent even to the most prohibitionist and most right-wing members of the Tory government that it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense for children to die protecting the world from a medical product of cannabis. So in 2018, the Chief Medical Officer, Sally Davis, said cannabis is a medicine, and she allowed it to be prescribed by any specialist for any indication. But that wasn't actually it hasn't proved very effective, although private physicians are prescribing. In the 20 months since cannabis has been a medicine on the NHS, there have only been 20 scripts. It's truly, truly outrageous. And there are children dying because they can't afford the private prescriptions of thousands of pounds a month. And only, I think 3 days ago, Billy got his NHS script. So 2 years after he came back and he was effectively allowed to have a prescription on the NHS, he's now got it. And this is outrageous. And there are certainly hundreds of children who are having seizures which are likely to benefit from cannabis. And there are many, many other people who are using cannabis illegally because they cannot get it from the NHS. And this, I think, is one of the greatest censorships of access of medicine that there's ever been. One of the reasons we have enormous problems in getting access to medical cannabis is that although it can be prescribed by any specialist for any indication, we actually, in a way, have the most liberal medical cannabis laws in the world, can only be prescribed by a specialist. That's a consultant. And the indications for which cannabis is most widely used are not indications that are necessarily seen by specialists. And there's way too few specialists to deal with all the, as I say, we estimate 1 million people every day are using illegal cannabis to treat a range of disorders, not just epilepsy. And specialists are also generally older people, often old white men like myself, who are rather resistant to patients telling them that they found a treatment for their ailments. And so making it a requirement that specialists prescribe cannabis has actually made it virtually impossible for any people to access cannabis. But not content with putting that barrier in the way, the government also put in an extra barrier. They said it's an unlicensed medicine, and that means that if you prescribe medical cannabis, you're not covered. In many cases, you're not covered by your indemnity organisation. You're certainly not covered by the NHS indemnity. So doctors have to take the risk on their own back. And they made it especially difficult because even though it was made a medicine in 2018, it was moved from the making of a medicine moved it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. And for technical reasons, I won't bore you with getting access to unlicensed medications through what's called the specials route for a Schedule 2 drug was close to impossible. The bureaucracy of importing medical cannabis, Schedule 2 medical cannabis into Britain, effectively tripled. The cost of the bureaucracy tripled the price of the product, which in itself was quite expensive anyway. So even where doctors want to prescribe, and there are NHS doctors who've seen their patients dramatically improve on medical cannabis and want to prescribe, usually the pharmacists in the clinical commissioning group refuse because they say it's too expensive and there's not a good enough evidence. NICE were also rather mealy-mouthed about this, and although they actually said it's perfectly acceptable for doctors to continue prescribing if there's evidence of efficacy in patients, they failed to even support treatment in conditions like Lennox-Gastaut where there is really good evidence. And that's a battle that's going on at present. So currently in Britain, the only endorsement, the only kind of NICE approved treatments that use cannabis are using a form called Epidiolex, which I'll talk about in a minute, for rare forms of childhood epilepsy, Nabilone and Dronabinol for nausea and vomiting due to chemotherapy, and Sativex, which is allowed for muscle pain due to multiple sclerosis. Although NICE bowed to pressure and accepted that Sativex could also be now used for pain as well as spasticity in multiple sclerosis. So, what is Sativex? Well, so Sativex is the only natural cannabis product licensed for use in the UK, so it's not a synthetic form of THC. It comes from the plants. It's patented 20 years ago by GW Pharmaceuticals. It was licensed initially for multiple sclerosis, pain. It didn't get a license for pain. It did get a license for spasticity, but the pain license has now been approved. It's a combination of THC and cannabidiol, and I'll explain what those are later on. But it also contains other cannabinoids. But it's an extract. It's not a complete plant product. And there are people who have used Sativex and found it less good, less effective, or have more side effects than whole plant products. And we don't fully understand why that is, and we can talk about that later. It's relatively expensive, and so it costs, the NICE analysis, at about £50,000 a year to reduce a disability-adjusted life year. And that was why NICE refused to make it available for pain initially, but after public pressure, they have accepted that it's worth it at that price. It's an interesting product because it's a spray. You spray it. It's basically what Queen Victoria used to use. It's an alcoholic tincture of cannabis, but instead of dropping it under the tongue, you spray it into the mouth. That accelerates absorption, and when it works, it works. But there's quite a lot of THC in it. There's about 3 milligrams of THC in every spray, and that's quite a lot of THC because the average joint has 6 milligrams of THC. So quite a few people do get rather stoned on it, and some people don't like it for that reason. And these are the other three products we have at present. So the left-hand two, Dronabinol and Nabilone, they are versions of THC, the active stoning ingredient in cannabis. And one of them is, Dronabinol is a synthetic version of it. It's used quite a lot in the States. Nabilone is a synthetic product which is very similar to THC. It works on the same receptor. That is licensed in the UK. And they're both basically available for nausea and vomiting from chemotherapy. So they're one of the treatments people can use who are having unpleasant side effects from cytotoxic drugs, and they should be used if other chemotherapy agents like apiprotant don't work. And Epidiolex, this is a new drug, only recently licensed, just last year, and it's cannabidiol, which is taken from the cannabis plant by GW Pharma. It's licensed in the UK and in the US and the European region for childhood epilepsy. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. So the current situation in Britain is complicated. It makes it very difficult for doctors to do, to use, because of its basically the fact that it's treated as a special and a Schedule 2 special. And as I intimated before, a lot of doctors choose not to prescribe it, and they say, well, there's not enough evidence. Show me the evidence, and I'll prescribe. And one of the great problems with the way cannabis has been dealt with over the last 100 years is that we haven't gathered the evidence, because it's a Schedule 2 drug, or Schedule 1 drug as it was then. And so you have this peculiar sort of circular logic that we don't have evidence because we're not allowed to research it. And that's part of the plan. The part of, I'm sure the UN thought that by making the drug illegal, people would not just stop using it, but they stop researching it. And that would kind of justify keeping it illegal because there was no evidence to make it legal. And this little graph on the right here is very interesting, because there was a resurgence of interest in the 1970s of using cannabis as a medicine. And then the 1971 convention tightened up on that. And you can see how the number of publications per year collapsed. So we had a 20-year hiatus when medical research on cannabis stopped. And that's why we don't have enough data, because we've treated it as being as dangerous a drug as crystal meth, another Schedule 1 drug. And yet it's clearly not. And in that intervening period, most of the doctors who knew anything about how to use medical cannabis have died. And I just want to just reiterate a couple of the issues that have faced the families that are using medical cannabis. So on the left-hand side, I've talked about the problems with prescribing and dispensing, the huge costs. There are patients that we're talking with who've had to sell their house so that they can pay the £2,000 a month it costs to supply their children, many of whom are actually being given this cannabis in the NHS, but it's been provided by their parents in order to keep their children alive. There's a relatively small range. In fact, I've showed you the range. It's basically THC or CBD or the fixed combination of Sativex. And that means, and we estimated over, as I said already, over 1 million people are using medical cannabis every day, and they're all relying on the black market. And on the right-hand side, you hear the top quote is from Billy's mum. So the reality is that for a period, she could only get her cannabidiol, which is actually illegal. Cannabidiol has always been legal in Britain, but the medicine was made very restricted. So you had to go to hospital in Belfast, 4-hour round trips twice a day to have her medicine dispensed in a hospital. Why? To protect the public against her taking it home. The idea is that if she takes it home, she might sell it. And there is an absurdity to this, and it comes from the fact that if you put drugs into Schedule 1, you end up finding that the law is an ass. And this is what other families are paying. Here's one example, paying £690 for a month's supply, which is about 3 times the black market price. And that's an important point, and I'm going to come to that when I talk about what drug science has done, because we have we have managed to organize it so that people who are currently using black market cannabis at around about 150 to 200 pounds a month can get medical grade cannabis for the same price, so they're not disadvantaged by switching from the black market. Sorry, I'm going to have a quick sip. So why did the British government drag its heels for restoring cannabis as a medicine? When, certainly 2 years ago, at that point, 27 US states had medical cannabis. Over 200 million Americans had access to medical cannabis, and many of them have had access to it for over 20 years. It's medicine in 20 other countries. Why did the British government drag its heels? Well, the answer is because it was politically expedient to do so, and that the right-wing newspapers, the Mail in particular, were very anti-cannabis. And the Tory governments and even the Labour government was scared of confronting the Mail. But they also had to justify this to the public. And they justified it in three ways. They justified it on the grounds that cannabis was going to cause schizophrenia. It was going to impair people's brains, especially young people's brains. And it was going to cause addiction. And I just want to take each of those apart in turn, because these are all straw men. They're all flawed arguments. And in fact, none of them relate to medical cannabis. They all relate to recreational use. And in fact, current policies on recreational cannabis are largely responsible for these problems. So our policies have actually driven up the harms of cannabis to justify, paradoxically, or maybe deliberately, the government keeping it banned. So let's look at schizophrenia. Well, the evidence now is as it was in the 1890 Indian Hemp Commission. Cannabis doesn't cause schizophrenia. What it might do, hard to prove, but it might well bring forward. So people who are predisposed to becoming psychotic, they may have their illness brought forward by a couple of years if they start smoking cannabis in their teens. What we do know is that if you smoke really strong cannabis, if you smoke skunk, 15% of cannabis, then the likelihood of you experiencing psychotic reactions is greater. And the problem is, our policies have essentially changed and distorted the cannabis market fundamentally. The prohibitionist policies that we've instigated from about 2004 have been relatively effective. They've dramatically dropped the importation of traditional hash and resin from places like Morocco. And they've led to homegrown cannabis. And you all know about the Vietnamese gangs taking over warehouses or people's houses or attics to grow hydroponic cannabis under perpetual ultraviolet light. And that form of growing leads to a distortion of the plant. So the plant makes very high concentrations of THC, which is what the growers want, because that's the active ingredient. And when it does that, it is unable to make the cannabidiol, which the traditional plant growing outdoors makes. And as I'll show you later, cannabidiol is a protective element against the psychotomimetic effects of THC. So we have, by trying to eliminate cannabis, made the forms of cannabis which people get. We haven't reduced cannabis consumption very much, or the number of people using it. All we've done is meant that they basically can only get skunk. 95% of all cannabis that's seized by the police now is strong THC, 15% or so. So we have produced a monster, which is particularly unpleasant for people who have psychosis, in a failed attempt to stop people who don't have psychosis getting something they weren't going to get anyway. And the second thing to say is that with medical use, it's very rare. So we've been auditing the New York City database. New York State database has had medical cannabis now for, I think, about 6 years. And we're trying to find examples of where people have become psychotic as a result of using medical cannabis. And the answer is they're vanishingly small. Why would they? Well, for two reasons, and it's very unlikely. Most people who use medical cannabis are way past the age at which they're likely to get schizophrenia. They're in their 40s and 50s and 60s. And also the formulation they're using is a balanced formulation. Memory loss and cognition. Well, it used to be, up till a couple of years ago, I used to get a paper a week or a question from a journalist every week. What about this paper that shows that cannabis causes brain damage? And I'd look at it and say, well, that's possible. It's a small effect. It's barely significant. It doesn't seem to have any obvious impact on performance. And by the way, do you know that the one drug that really causes brain damage, and I can show you scans of brain damage, is alcohol? And they all turn away. They're not interested. No one's interested in brain damage when it's caused by the drug we all love to drink. Brain damage has been, something that's been held up as a justification for keeping cannabis illegal. And the answer is there is no evidence that cannabis causes brain damage. It's true that if you're a 15-year-old kid is smoking cannabis every day and is stoned so much that he can't do any schoolwork, he's probably going to end up with a slightly lower IQ and lower exam grades than people who aren't. But that's quite rare. And most of the work claiming brain problems with cannabis, most of the effects can be explained by other variables such as poor parenting, poverty, diet, etc. And then there's addiction, and this is an issue, and it's an issue as the chairman introduced at the beginning. And again, it's an issue because of our policies. If your sole exposure to cannabis is high strength skunk, you are more likely to get addicted. And I'll go back to a historical comparison. You will probably all be aware that when the regulations on distillation, distilling spirits were loosened in the 1700s, gin became very available and very cheap. And people were drinking gin in half-pint glasses in the same way as they were drinking beer, because the tax on each was the same. And there were huge problems. And skunk is to traditional cannabis as gin is to beer. It's much stronger. And the way you deal with that problem is not to punish people for using skunk, but is to try to get people to use much less of it. And the only way to do that is to have some kind of regulated market where the taxation on high strength cannabis is so high that people don't use it. And if we did that, we would massively reduce the level of addiction to cannabis. Cannabis, there is an almost perfect relationship between the increased strength of cannabis on the street and the rise of dependence. They're separated by 2 years. So when concentrations rise 2 years later, people seeking help for dependence rise. Utterly predictable. As I say, we've known about that really since the gin craze in the 1760s. Well, cannabis, look, is not completely free of problems. There are side effects. Yeah, some people get whities. They get a fall in blood pressure, they can go pale, they can vomit, they can feel shaky. It can cause confusion, particularly in people who haven't used it before, and people who accidentally take a deep, deep inhalation of skunk. They can go very, very, very disturbed. But those effects are pretty short-lasting, and they usually resolve within an hour or so of taking cannabis. The evidence of long-term effects in normal users, certainly in medical users, is really very marginal. I want to talk now a bit about the endocannabinoid system, because it's important to understand what's going on with cannabis. And the first thing to say is that, well, hopefully you're aware of the fact that the endocannabinoid system is a remarkable system. Only been discovered about 30 years ago. One of the great pioneers in cannabis research was a British scientist from Aberdeen called Roger Pertwee, who has made huge discoveries in terms of cannabis and the different components of the cannabis plant, none of which have ever been commercialized in Britain. They've been commercialized in Israel, they've been commercialized in America, But they've not been commercialized in Britain because he's not been allowed to do the studies because cannabis is a dangerous Schedule 1 drug. So it's another example of where Britain led the world in the science, but we have been completely written out of the script because of our regulation. We've not been able to develop them as medicine. Anyway, the endocannabinoid system is a natural system. It's found in all through the body, and it has a number of roles. And there are two main active ingredients. So at the bottom of the graph on the left, you see there are two substances. One's called 2-AG and the other's called anandamide. And basically, these are the body's natural cannabinoids. They're like THC. They work on receptors, which we call cannabis receptors, because they were discovered by the binding of synthetic cannabinoids, which are on the right, and those are the phytocannabinoids. And the really interesting question is, why does the body make this stuff that's like cannabis? And the answer is because it's necessary, because it's useful, and because it's important, and I'll show you why. So just a little bit of biochemistry here. Cannabis, THC, and the endocannabinoids, they all bind to a receptor called the cannabis receptor, the CB1 receptor. There's also a CB2 receptor. The CB1 receptor is largely in the brain. The CB2 receptor is in the immune system. And the CB1 receptor is a particular kind of receptor. It's called a G protein link receptor, and you can see a picture of it. And these G protein link receptors are all the same. They all have these 7 transmembrane rings, and they all regulate an intracellular messenger called cyclic AMP. And G protein receptors are the receptors that are activated by dopamine and by noradrenaline, by almost all the hormonal neurotransmitters in the brain. So there's a lot of these G protein receptors around, but interestingly, there are more cannabis receptors in the brain than any other receptor. There's more of them than the dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline receptors put together. And that tells you they're really important, and they're on pretty much most of the neurons in the brain. And the different effects of cannabis are mediated through different brain regions where these different receptors are. And this slide just shows, where the effects of cannabis receptor stimulation leads to problems or beneficial effects. So, for instance, the calming effects of cannabis are mediated through the cerebral cortex. The effects on Parkinsonism to reduce spasticity and tremor are mediated through the basal ganglia. The munchies are mediated through the hypothalamus, etc. So pretty much every part of the brain has cannabis receptors, and that explains why the broad range of effects of cannabis, but also why medical cannabis can have such a profound effect on so many different disorders, particularly different brain disorders. Cannabis is unusual. The reason it took us so long to work out how cannabis worked was because it doesn't work in the traditional way of the cannabis neurotransmitter system is an unusual system, and that it's reactive rather than active. And I'll very briefly, these are synapses when the main neurotransmitter in the brain is called glutamate. When glutamate is released, and glutamate release is responsible for pretty much everything we do. The glutamate stimulates the receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, and then the endocannabinoids get released to act on the presynaptic CB1 receptors to regulate the release of glutamate. And that is almost certainly one reason why cannabinoids can control epilepsy, because epilepsy is, in many cases, a disorder of excess glutamate, because glutamate is it's the stimulatory neurotransmitter. So the endocannabinoid system is essentially a feedback homeostatic system. So it's unusual and maybe unique in that sense. It goes backwards from across the synapse. The two endocannabinoids, the 2-AG and the anandamide, they have different roles. One is much more responsible for what we call tonic activity. That's the 2-AG. It's there all the time, giving the appropriate level of modulation to the brain That's a bit like the oil in your car. It lubricates the function of the brain. And then anandamide, that's there's not much of it around, but it seems to be very stress responsive. So when you put your foot down, it's a bit like sort of putting the gas into the car. You get an activity of this, which then can lead to what can produce protection of the brain, and also can potentially moderate some of the effects of the other 2-AG. Exogenous cannabinoids, well, I've shown you pictures of these already. These are made by the plant. They're called phytocannabinoids, and one of them is THC. There's THC. And it's complicated. People say, well, how does THC work? Well, it stimulates the receptors. But one of the interesting concepts which is emerging now from our understanding of THC is that it's what's called a partial agonist of the receptor. So in situations where there is a low level of endocannabinoids, THC will then activate the receptor. But if there's lots of endocannabinoids, THC will block them and have less of an effect. So this is the concept that's being developed of phytocannabinoids as being adaptogens, that they can work differently depending on whether the system needs stimulation or dampening down. Here's CBD. You see it's a very similar molecule, but it has a different effect. It doesn't bind to the CB1 receptor, but it can modulate in ways we don't fully understand the effects of THC. So it changes the structure of the receptor so that it's less active. And there are now interesting trials. There's a huge trial. The Wellcome Trust got a massive trial going on using cannabidiol to treat early onset schizophrenia, because of the evidence that if you give cannabidiol to people with THC, it moderates, it reduces the psychotomimetic effects of the THC. And now people are saying, yeah, maybe cannabidiol by itself can be antipsychotic. I mean, there are small studies showing it might be. In fact, there's a very interesting study from Anaheim in Germany showing that actually when people recover from schizophrenia, their levels of the endocannabinoids go up, as if the endocannabinoids are actually protective for schizophrenia. So there's a very complicated question at present. But CBD is also the anti-epileptic agent for some forms of seizures, although THC can also have that role. And there's a very recent study, and this is particularly relevant to many of you in the audience, showing that CBD, particularly at 400 milligrams a day, that's the optimal dose, CBD can help people stop using THC. It reduces consumption of THC in people who are dependent on THC. So again, supporting the view that it would have been much better if we hadn't tried to eliminate cannabis and allowed people to carry on smoking a balanced mixture. We probably wouldn't have the rise in dependence. I want to finish by telling you about this super new project that drug science has developed. And it's called Project 2021, and it's about rolling out medical cannabis to people that are using black market cannabis with a view to really getting an evidence base in the UK of its effectiveness, and also finding out what its side effects are, what the drawbacks are, and getting doctors who are interested in prescribing it access to it and patients getting access at a cost that they can afford. It's called 2021 because it's in collaboration with a patient group. It's a multi-stakeholder group, and one of the stakeholders was the organization called the National Patients Alliance, and they had 20,000 patients. And so that's where the 20 comes from. And the 21 is that we want to finish by 2021. And we're hoping to have 20,000 patients, all those patients who were in on the books of the National Patients Alliance. We want, if who are using black market cannabis, we want to give them access to medical grade cannabis at a price they can afford. So it's a registry, and it's a real world registry. It's not a controlled trial. People are coming into the study. They're seeing doctors. the doctor believes that the cannabis they're using has helped them and believes that they should continue using cannabis, they can get it prescribed. It's a partnership with academia, industry, clinicians and patients. I'll explain that more in a minute. As I say, it's going to give us evidence on effectiveness and also tolerability. It's the data is being collected in a modern, sophisticated, and very accessible online repository. Drug Science is going to publish the data whether it's positive or not. This is about knowing the truth about medical cannabis. So the stakeholders, I've already mentioned the patients, but we've got 6 licensed producers signed up. We have to get access to the cannabis. No cannabis products are made in Britain. It has to be imported. So we've got 6 collaborators from around the world. We've got this database. We've set up, and we're working with prescribers. We have 6 or more clinics now around the country that have doctors who are trained in medical cannabis who can prescribe as appropriately. The producers are making more and more different forms available. We have now forms which are pure CBD. We have forms which are strong THC, and we have forms which are strong CBD, low THC. But all the products are whole plant products. They're not extracts. And this is important because patients are telling us that the whole plant products are better than the extracts. And that may be because the plant itself has other active ingredients. There are probably 100 different cannabinoids in the plants, mostly at low concentrations, but the plants also make other things like terpenes. And some terpenes are sedatives, some terpenes are stimulatory. So there's a lot of interest in the additive effect. And this combination of multiple different phytoactive ingredients is called the entourage effect. And there's sufficient anecdotal evidence from patients that we believe this is the way forward rather than using the extracts. And also we've got the drug science experts. We've set up an academic committee to oversee this. So the real world data, well, people come into the trial and they have to give us access to their medical notes. We have to be able to talk to the GPs. We need to know what their illnesses are, and we have to get the GP to tell us that when they tell us they got a disorder that's susceptible, that allows them to go into the study, that they've actually got it. So this way we're trying to avoid people just coming in to get recreational cannabis. The outcomes are patient-reported outcomes as well as medical doctor-reported outcomes. It's 3-monthly intervals. We're doing statistical analysis. We've got a statistical plan that involves using state-of-the-art statistical approaches such as regression and trajectory measurements. And we're doing this we can do this on a real-time basis. We can interrogate the database anytime we like. We will impute missing data to make sure that we've got the best estimates of effect as we can. And as I said, drug science contain the data. Companies will have access to the data for reporting adverse effects to the regulatory bodies. And of course, companies are responsible for providing the products, but they won't have any say over what we report. Now, in order to make sure that when we do report this, the academic world and the medical world takes notice, we put together a scientific oversight board, and these are a number of, as you can see, relatively senior academics from top institutions in Britain that bring a particular expertise to the study. So there's me at the top. Eileen Joyce is a neurologist who's very interested in Tourette syndrome. She's one of the people running the National Tourette Service. There's Michael Linsky is our epidemiologist. Some of you who work in addiction will know he was a very senior member of the National Addiction Centre for many years. Val Curran is a professor of psychopharmacology at Imperial College London, and she's a world expert on cannabis. She conducted the trial that showed cannabidiol could treat cannabis use disorder. And then there's Adam Winstock, who runs Global Drug Survey and is an addiction psychiatrist. Alan Fayez, who is a consultant in pain medicine at University College. Elizabeth Iverson, who's an old age physician and who's become one of the UK's most trained people in medical cannabis. She trained in Canada and is now running clinics in Britain. And Tim Williams, who is a head of medical lead for a psychiatry trust in Bristol, and also is a consultant in addiction psychiatry. So we're very confident that what we do has got the right level of scientific oversight. So the way we have constructed the 2021 initiative is to include people with these conditions. And each condition will have standardized rating according to what our experts think is the best scale. Now, for chronic pain, it'll be the brief pain inventory form. For anxiety disorders, the GAD-7. For PTSD, it's the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist. For Tourette's, it's the Yale tick severity. For multiple sclerosis, it's the expanded disability. For substance use disorders, it's the severity of dependence scale. And for epilepsy, we haven't started the epilepsy program yet. And the reason for that is that the amount of these children need is much higher than that for the other disorders, and we've been trying to negotiate the price down with the companies to get it to a price that they can afford. And we've achieved that now. For all these other disorders, people can get their medical cannabis at £150 a month. For the children, it may be up to 300, but that's still a massive saving on what they had before. The other point to make is this, and this is really important. One of the things that's become very clear from talking to patients who use medical cannabis illegally is that medical cannabis doesn't just treat the symptoms, but it also makes them feel better. And that's for two reasons. One is that if they can escape from many of the unwanted side effects of the medication they're on at present. And some of the children were on 7 different anticonvulsants. Their brains were being scrambled by the drugs they were on. And secondly, there are mood elevating effects, there are anxiety reducing effects of cannabis. So well-being is something that patients often describe. If they're using cannabis for pain, it might not be any better than the opioids, but they're not constipated, they're not confused, and they can sleep better. So we're collecting for every disorder, we're collecting standardized measures of sleep and quality of life and mood. And if we do get 20,000 patients through, this will be the largest database of these kind of questionnaires there's probably ever been. These are the clinics that are currently providing assessments and prescriptions. So there's quite a number of them. And the great thing, if there's the only thing I suppose that the only benefit COVID has brought to us is that now we're more comfortable doing everything online. And so these clinics are now being run virtually. And that means that patients from every corner of Britain, including Northern Ireland, can have access through the internet to a clinician to help them get into the network to get a prescription, etc. So this is now completely available across all the country. I mean, if you want to go and see someone face to face, you can, but you don't have to. I've talked about most of this already. So the criteria for getting into the study is you have to have a history of 2 licensed medications prescribed and proven ineffective. So we're not treating people who have just developed a syndrome and want to sample medical cannabis as a drug. We're using this where other licensed indications have failed. Again, I've talked quite a bit about this, but the bottom line is for £150 a month, you can have these different kinds of medications. You can have THC and CBD, or you can have lots of CBD and more THC, or you can have the dried flower, which is strong in THC, which flower has some advantages for people with pain syndromes, it suddenly break through. They can vaporize the flower and get a sort of immediate benefit, which can be very helpful to them. So you can see if you want 2 of them, then you can. It might cost more, but we're hoping that the majority of people will get significant benefit from just one of these prescriptions. And sorry, the slide's the writing's a bit small, but the bottom line is how to get there, and this is important for you if you've got patients that might want to see if it's going to be useful. They register online. The Drug Science website has got a link. You register online. You get notified about where you can go. You refer yourself, or you can be referred from a clinician or some other healthcare professional. You get assessed. You get the prescription. And you can only get the prescription if you agree that your data on your diagnosis, your symptoms, and your questionnaire data can go into the registry. The only way you can get it. So it's critical because it's what we're trying to do is we've put a huge effort into making this data into making this treatment available. It's really important that we get the maximum amount of information out of the study, and then of course we'll do the follow-up. And in fact, by the end of the year, we will have done the first analysis of the first few hundred patients. That's because there's a special issue of a journal called Psychopharmacology. We're going to put it into that as part of an article on 2021. Where does it come from? I'm sorry if the image of the world isn't very clear here, but it's coming from companies that are based in Colombia, in Jamaica, in Europe, and also Australia. And all the products are GMP, good manufacturing. They're all approved by the MHRA as being a medical standard. And I'm getting the end now. This just shows the pathway. This is our roadmap. We started here. We started in 2019 when we realized that patients were being let down. They'd been given the prospect of medical cannabis by Sally Davis, saying it's a medicine. And a year later, there were just 10 prescriptions on the NHS. We realized that patients were being disadvantaged. So we decided to do it differently. It would have been nice to have done it in the NHS, but the NHS isn't ready for this. So we've done it through the private system where doctors are more flexible and possibly more interested in novel treatments. And you can see we've progressed. We launched here in August, and the epilepsy people are kind of come in now. So it's been a long haul. It's been a very challenging thing to do, but we've got a great team. And I think it's going to go from strength to strength. So just my last slide, we've got 8,000 patients who've registered an interest now. We've got enormous quality training for physicians who want to prescribe have to go through an approved cannabis training scheme, which is now being run by the Medical Cannabis Clinician Society with help from us. We've got every charity that supports the patients, pretty much every charity that supports the patients we're studying have agreed to collaborate with us. And we've already got over 200 patients going through. So I think that's my last slide. If you want to read more about it, go on the Drug Science website. Here are 3 papers which have come out relatively recently. There's my essay that sort of kick-started all this last year, challenging the medical profession to really try to learn about medical cannabis. And then there are 2 very recent papers, which is still challenging the medical profession, but also challenging health authorities, NICE, etc., to basically be honest about the value of medical cannabis and not to pretend that it's the evil that they used to pretend it was, and to try to find out really what its role is in Western medicine, in British medicine. Patients tell us it has a huge role, and they might not all be right, but I think if 1 million people are saying it's useful, I think it's likely to be. Thank you very much. So very happy to take questions now.
I can't say thank you. Professor, that was fascinating, conversation. There's been a couple of questions already coming through the question and answer. So could I steer a couple of them towards you? And
Yes.
you've already answered. Because there were a number of people that began to ask, what was the implication for people in Northern Ireland? And I think because all the clinics seem to be based in mainland UK, but I think you seem to answer that, that anybody can sign up for this.
Anyone can access any clinic. I think all the clinics are working virtually now. So it really is, it's up to you. I mean, ethically, I cannot recommend, all the clinics have signed up. I cannot recommend any clinic. I wouldn't want to. I think it would be just a question. They're all charging about the same for the primary consultations, but not the same. You could ring up 2 or 3 if you wanted and just see what the waiting list would be. That you want to just go on our line. But I think probably the first thing, go onto the website, register an interest. We'll get back to you probably the same day, and you can take it from there. And then the prescriptions. Let me just elaborate a little bit. That is important. The prescriptions will then be sent to a provider. And then it'll be sent to your home, so you wouldn't even have to go and collect the prescription.
Okay, and I think you've alluded to this. And I think it's worth asking. There's then a cost to the individual participants.
Yes. So the cost, there are 2 costs. There's the cost of the initial assessment, which we by and large got down to rather low. And private medicine is not free. But we've managed to get it down between about 150 and 200 pounds for the initial assessment. And then the prescriptions are no more than 150 pounds a month for a specific product. And that is pretty good value, I think. A lot of people seem to feel that's right. And I've had people emailing me on a regular basis saying, at last, because it's hugely stressful for someone getting black market cannabis for 2 reasons. The first is very often these people are disabled, so they can't get it themselves. I mean, you can't go out in a wheelchair and down to a street, you just can't do it. So you have to send someone out, usually your partner. If that partner gets arrested, can be done for dealing, and under the Proceeds of Crime Act, they can be prosecuted. And we've got plenty of examples of, and prosecution under the Proceeds of Crime Act means it's a disaster. They freeze your assets. You can't pay your mortgage. You have no credit cards. And it can take months for that to be released. And we think often the police do it in a vindictive way. So it liberates individuals from the risk of being called drug dealers when they're simply trying to get health product for their partners.
There's another really practical question coming in with a lot of likes. And I'm going to apologize, folks. I'm not going to be able to read all your questions. The Professor Nutt will get as many as we can. When you're treated for, say, alcohol dependence, you are responsible for notifying the DVLA about your medical treatment. If you're prescribed cannabis, does it affect your ability to hold a driver's license?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I have to say, I don't think there is a single answer to that. I think that would be a discussion to have with the prescribing doctor. I think if you were on cannabidiol-based medicine, it would have no impact at all. If you were on a strong if you were driving and suddenly had severe pain and you had to stop and take a vape of flour, then you probably shouldn't be driving after that. So I think it has to be done on a case-by-case basis. If you feel that the medication could impair you, then you should either inform them or just not drive.
Okay, thank you for that. There's another question coming in that you seem to get, I think, very early on. I'm just living through here. For the public to understand this, the difference between, I think you've alluded to, you did talk about the difference between medicinal cannabis and the cannabis people know from buying it on the streets, our young people and people using it recreationally, but also maybe throw in the difference between black market medication people are buying. So how do you help people understand the difference between medicinal cannabis and cannabis we buy off.
Sure. Well, black market cannabis, you have no knowledge of the provenance. You have unless you actually know a dealer that grows their own and grows in a reliable way, you have no idea what you're getting. And all you can be pretty sure of is it's going to have almost guaranteed no CBD, so you won't have the protective element. So you'll have a range of strengths of THC, which will range probably from about 12 to about 18% of THC. So, but it may have other things in it as well. If you're giving, it's sold by weight, people contaminate it with things that increase the weight. So you really have very little idea of what you're getting, and that is second to the risk of being arrested. I think that's the second biggest problem, that you can't reliably self-medicate because you can't be sure you can get the same thing each time, and even if you ask for the same thing, you may not get it.
There's another question, bringing NICE back into the conversation. Do you think NICE will consider the findings of Project 2021?
Well, we have kept NICE informed. We have had dialogues with the MHRA, with Public Health England, and they're all very interested because this could resolve the paradox, the problem. Either way, I mean, it may turn out that after 2 years, very few people report any benefit, and they stop using. Or it may show that it's very effective for some of those disorders that we are using. And we've done an interesting. We've published a paper that in that list of publications, perhaps the one for this audience is the last one. It came out in BMJ Open just last month, because there we basically provide a different way of thinking about effectiveness, about efficacy, clinical efficacy. I mean, NICE have a very specific role in decision making in Britain, and I explained it a bit earlier on. Basically, they look to see whether the cost of a treatment is less than between 35,000. Well, it's £35,000 a year in terms of per disability life years saved. And if it's more than that, they say it's not cost effective. Now, the only data up till now, the data they've used to make those decisions has almost always been, not always, but almost always been based on randomized controlled trials, which are very, very expensive. They cost certainly tens of millions of pounds. So in the cannabis field, there are very few of them, and the reasons for that are that cannabis is a plant for medical, these plant products. Actually, there are technical reasons why these studies are quite challenging to do, and on top of that, there's also the question of, can you patent that particular plant product? And no one has actually been able to establish that yet. So companies they can't raise the money to spend £20 million on a trial where you couldn't even be sure you could have a patent. So what we have is very little data. And doctors are saying, oh, well, without data, without these controlled double-blind studies that NICE have put through their algorithm for cost effectiveness, we cannot make a decision. But in our BMJ paper, we're saying, well, look, hang on a sec, that's not how medicine works. As a doctor, it doesn't matter what the controlled trials say. I can never predict in an individual patient whether a medicine will work. Each patient is their own control. That is the nature of medicine. There is no controlled trial which could ever guarantee that it will work. We know that. We know that for most drugs, 30% respond to placebo and 60% respond to the drug. So there's at least 40% who won't respond to the drug. So every time we make a prescription in a patient, we are doing an experiment. Now, these patients have done the experiment for us. they have been ill, they have had other medications, they've switched to medical cannabis, and they've got better. And that is very powerful evidence. And in fact, we've done a computation on the children with medical, using medical cannabis for epilepsy. We're writing a paper, it's going out, it's going to be published quite soon. There are 9 children who have done that experiment, and they have gone from all sorts of medical interventions, including vagal nerve stimulation, implanted electrodes into their chest wall, to medical cannabis. And all of them responded, and the reduction in seizure frequency is at least 10-fold overall, and in some people it's 1,000-fold. So we have now, using the Bayesian statistics, we can say that the next child that goes into that treatment has a 92% chance of responding. That is better data than any controlled trial, a randomized controlled trial, could ever give you. And we believe you should use that data, because that's actually what doctors do in the real world. They treat people. They don't do trials.
I think a lot of people appreciated that answer. And hopefully NICE will listen to you, because I think, unfortunately, a lot of our medical colleagues are very, we're guided by NICE. If NICE agree, we'll listen. If they don't, we struggle.
Yes.
There's another question coming in, and a lot of people are liking this, and this is, coming back to, the political and the public opinion of the benefits of cannabis. We're seeing a lot of advertisements from body shops to creams with CBD products. Do you think that will aid or devalue, the amount of the amount of public use of CBD products? Will that aid or devalue your work?
Well, it's a great question, and I don't know that I know the answer. All I do know is that the doses that you are getting in those products are they're very low, and it's questionable whether they have an effect. They've never been shown to have an effect. What has happened, just as a sort of an aside, the MHRA has made it very clear to anyone selling CBD products that they mustn't make medical claims because unless they've got data. I think it's unlikely you can make medical claims, but a lot of people report some kind of benefit. So the great thing about CBD is it's very safe. So it's probably safer than taking vitamins, high dose vitamins. So I think you're probably all right if you're taking them, but it's a pretty expensive placebo probably.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think a lot of people are liking this question, so I'm just going to read it. How would you speak to young people who see cannabis simply as a recreational drug and would argue that it surely can't have any harms if it's also being used as for medicinal purposes?
Well, I would very easy question to answer. I just say, read Professor Nutt's book, Drugs Without the Hot Air. I think if you've got a kid, every 15-year-old should read it because children need to understand the harms of drugs. There's no point in saying don't. If you say to kids cannabis is dangerous, they'll say that's rubbish because we know it's not dangerous. It's a medicine. But if you say but fentanyl's a medicine and that kills people, they might. So you have to tell kids the truth. And truth is, alcohol is more likely to kill them than cannabis. Cannabis is potentially damaging to their education if they get dependent. So I'm a great believer in actually trying to avoid the use of any drugs till you leave home and go to university, and that way you're surrounded by peers and you can actually have a kind of more reasoned discussion. But I'm a really strong believer in education. Children should be told the truth about the harms of different drugs, and then if they make whatever they do, then at least they've not been misled. And it's if you lie to your kids, they'll just assume that everything you say is a lie. So it's much better to tell them the truth.
Sorry, I got to throw in my own question from what you just said. Have you worked with anybody to disseminate the information in your book that's accessible to young people from a health literacy, from a language, from a format point of view? So it's
You just
available.
froze. Sorry, you just froze. Say that all again. I didn't get that.
You said we should get young people to read your book. Excellent, that's good. But I know a lot of young people wouldn't go near books. But have you worked with anybody to take the information from that book and put it in a
Maybe.
format that's accessible for kids?
Yeah, well, it is. I've written it for a kind of 14-year-old. It's not a difficult book. I mean, it's a book for the general public. It's quite a big book, and yeah, it's a really important point. And one of the drug science. We're a small charity. It's this 2021 initiative is using a lot of our resources. We would dearly like to have a proper educational package for all young children on all drugs, and that's something we are working towards. And if there are people out there that want to do that or support us doing that, then let me know, because I think it's absolutely.
We're almost in the works. We've frozen that question,
On
but
our
I heard
website, information, but we need educational packages. I completely agree with you. We need them. I mean, most of the stuff that's provided, the only people currently providing drugs education materials for teachers doing that.
Okay, unfortunately you froze there, but
I'm going to turn my video off as well, I think, because you're freezing too. I'm wondering if we're getting into some
good
problem.
point.
Turn yours off.
So,
did you hear that answer?
Like,
yeah, my answer was that we're really keen. Drug science has always wanted to have good education material for schools. We just don't have the resources. If there's an educationalist listening who wants to help us and I've got time to put into doing that, we would be delighted, absolutely delighted to work with people to help us do that. We've got the expertise, but we need to turn that into materials.
I think there could be some people in this audience that would be drooling at the mouth when they heard you say that. So that sounds excellent.
Well, get them to email me. I think my email was on the slides. It's d.nutt, Nutt, at imperial.ac.uk, or you can contact me through the drug science website.
Brilliant. There's another question coming in. Will people with autism, could they be part of Project 2021?
That's a great question. I've been at it a few times. It depends on their symptoms. So if they meet the symptoms for anxiety or trauma or pain, they could. But we're not, or Tourette's even, but we're not, autism isn't a separate theme yet. We're discussing whether to put it in. It's an important question. But possibly, the answer is it depends on which symptoms they've got. If they meet those criteria, they could be.
Right. That's quite good. There's another question. There's two questions that seem to be linked. Do you ever, see the potential of cannabis being reclassified? And I'm going to roll this question into it. What direction do you see political landscape toward medicinal cannabis heading over the next 5 years?
Well, I think all the political parties in Britain accept that cannabis is a medicine. And the Tory, Hancock has been quite lame in doing anything. Partly
Ed, can you hear okay?
I can,
Yeah.
but I can't hear anybody else.
Okay, we've lost, just see there, we've lost Professor Nutt off the call.
Okay.
So maybe if we just, Ed, if you maybe just want to round things up, and if he joins in again, we can say our goodbyes to him.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Can people hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hey, everybody. Gremlins in the works, folks. The joys of remote working, whether you use BlueJeans, Zoom, or the meeting platform. Now, the one thing we didn't hear were any dogs barking. You don't do a Zoom call without hearing dogs or kids. We didn't hear that, but unfortunately, we lost Professor Nutt. Really disappointed because the questions were coming in thick and fast. I will apologize if we didn't get your question answered. But it was a fascinating conversation. Where this goes, it presents the individual with a treatment option. And I particularly, liked when you have had prescribed medication that didn't work, you have an option. I think there'll be loads of other thoughts and questions that I would encourage people to talk to our connection workers, locally. What could this mean for people? In addictions, could I raise a thought? How many people do we know that have chronic, relapsing, episodes with their addiction? And that was a question I'd love to explore, some of the properties behind that. So I'm not sure. I think it raised as many questions as it did answers. But, I really want to say on behalf of, just personally, I really want to thank the Connection folks for putting this on today. I'll apologize for the gremlins in the works. It happens. In Downpatrick, we lost our electricity twice over the last couple of weeks. So that could have happened where Professor Nutt was. But I want to thank the Connection folks for organizing this. Thank you all for coming. The evaluation panel, I think you'll either be posting that out or let us know what you think. And we hope you got something from today. Yeah,
we'll send out the evaluation. It might pop up when you log off. I'm not sure. We set it up, but I don't know. I'm not sure. So we will send out an evaluation and really appreciate all your feedback. So thank you, everybody. Sorry for the abrupt ending.
Well, we're only 10 minutes shy. So that's not too bad.
Yeah, perfect. Okay.